Hey, welcome everyone to episode 3 of season 5 of the Northern Spin podcast. My name is Michael Taylor. By day, I'm the editor of thebusinessdesk.com. At the risk of sounding like my co-presenter, Chris Maguire, right here, we've got some good news.
That's right, Michael. We've got 2 bits of good news, actually. I spoke to Sean Hines of Manchester Central last week, and it's literally just a question of when we want the 10,000-seater auditorium for our big show. But on a serious note, specialist lender Assets Capital is our latest sponsor, and we're going to hear from them later. We've also had some really nice feedback from former police hostage negotiator Nigel Taberner, who wrote on Twitter, I don't use the term X, the podcast just gets better by the week.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you very much, Nigel. Chris, you hosted 6 events last week. So what political insight are you bringing from those events to this week's Northern Spin?
Yeah, we talk about insight all the time, actually. I chatted to a number of MPs and business leaders. So the first thing we're going to talk about follows reports that the government is going to bin off the stretch of line from Birmingham to Manchester for High Speed 2. I should say that Business Minister, who I interviewed at the Warrington Business Conference on Friday, a chap called Kevin Hollinrake, described me as Warrington's answer to Ricky Gervais.
Or David Brent, was it? Or was it Ricky
I think
Gervais?
it was more Ricky Gervais.
Okay. Well, I think Ricky Gervais should sue for that comparison, frankly. Anyway, on the podcast this week, I want to talk about Baroness Charlotte Owen of Alderley Edge, who was appointed to the House of Lords by Boris Johnson at the age of 29. I also want to talk about Matthew Brown, not the brewery in Lancashire, but the leader of Preston City Council, who described Preston as the alternative city, which is overblown nonsense in my view.
I've got some views on that as well. Nationally, I think we're going to talk about the fact that it does feel like we're on an election footing. Labour have upped the ante at long last, and we've got some announcements from Keir Starmer.
Before all that, though, we've got a few thank yous, starting with our producers, What Media, who expertly produce this podcast every single week. They're the unsung heroes of the Northern Spin podcast, the kings of video content creation, and they turn our weekly ramblings into the hit podcast and YouTube show that is Northern Spin.
That's right, and What Media really do go above and beyond. I'd also like to thank our headline sponsors, FI Real Estate Management. FI Real Estate Management is headquartered in Chorley, Lancashire, but has a network of properties across the UK which tenants can tap into. They can also cater for everyone from a one-man band working from home and needing space to enterprise customers wanting a whole building. They don't just work in one sector, they work across the office, commercial and industrial markets. FI Real Estate Management pride themselves on growing with their customers on their journey. If you need space, contact FI, Matthew Pickles in particular.
Right, Chris, so let's talk about HS2. Is it the end of the line for Britain's biggest rail engineering project in a generation? Quick recap. HS2 was first mooted in 2009. HS1, of course, was the railway through your old neck of the woods, Kent, to the Channel Tunnel near Folkestone from London. It originally started from Waterloo, then it went all the way through the Kent countryside. It now goes to a terminus at St Pancras. Costs have escalated, and last week the government refused to guarantee the future of the HS2 rail line between Birmingham and Manchester. Andy Burnham is rightly furious and tweeted, "Levelling up my arse." For what it's worth, my issue on this, I'm going to stop ranting in a minute, has always been this has been missold. It was supposed to be about capacity, but it was never explained what new trains will go on the West Coast Main Line when the London to Manchester trains are going to be running on HS2. It was meant to link up to the St Pancras Eurostar terminal initially, which meant you could get direct trains from Manchester to Paris and Brussels. That was the first compromise. That didn't happen. The terminus was then going to be at Euston. Secondly, there was always the risk that it wouldn't actually be two-way, that it would end up being a talent funnel to increase London's reach rather than the other way around. And thirdly, if HS2 really was about getting the north better infrastructure, then why didn't they build it from the north first, effectively connecting Birmingham and places in the Midlands to Manchester Airport and the city centre? What do you think?
That, Michael, is not a rant. That's a well-rounded opinion. I think High Speed 2 is an object lesson on how not to do major infrastructure projects. I remember when I became the editor of North West Insider, following in your footsteps, and one of my first front pages was a picture of High Speed 2 and, the future. And like that was 2011, if my memory serves me correct. It's just to give you a scale of how long it was ago, 2012, something like that. And I remember speaking to Howard Bernstein, Chief Executive of Manchester Council at the time, and he said, Chris, it's not about getting from Manchester to London quicker, it's about capacity. And we have to get improved capacity. So
it was actually Howard who sold me on the basis that it was about getting from Manchester connecting better to Europe. That's not going to happen if you kind of pitch up at Euston and then have to walk down with your suitcase up to St Pancras. It's
ridiculous.
We're missold, compromise after compromise.
I think Andy Burnham summed it up best in the second half of the tweet, which you mentioned earlier, when he said, levelling up my arse. And he said, the government is guilty of gross mismanagement of High Speed 2 and of making the North pay for their future. Just quick mention of a couple of salient facts. 2021, the eastern leg of HS2 to Leeds was scrapped. A lot of people think it's about faster trains to London. It's actually, as we've discussed, about improving the capacity in our creaking rail network.
Do you think it is though?
I think it's dressed up. I think the thing
more
is,
trains from Stoke to Stockport, for instance. I just don't see it. I don't see the demand for the services that it say it's freeing up capacity for, or indeed the increasing freight traffic on the West Coast Main Line as well. I don't see it.
Well, I interviewed the business minister, Kevin Hollinrake, and
is he the one that called you Ricky Gervais?
Yeah, he did. And I said to him, "Hey, listen, tell us about the reports about High Speed 2 and the fact that the government are going to bin off the link to Manchester from Birmingham." And he said his exact words were, "Don't believe everything you read in the media."
Dear. Oh dear, what does that mean? That is, to me, that just sounds like typical snooty Tory deflection.
Well, actually, I was quite impressed with him, actually.
You're such a sucker for a smooth Tory.
You know what, actually? I was going to get a picture taken with him and the other MPs there, and I thought, no, if I do that, I'll just get stick from Michael Taylor.
You will anyway.
Yeah, you will, yeah.
So you might as well.
What was interesting was the conversation, and this is where I think the argument is, the conversation quickly turned from improving High Speed 2 to improving rail services from the east to west in the Northern Powerhouse Rail. Now, a lot of people refer to Northern Powerhouse Rail as like High Speed 3, and the idea behind it will connect the cities across the north. I mean, a lot of people think it's just weasel words. Hollinrake, who, as I mentioned, came across quite well, didn't have any cheap digs at the Labour Party, which a lot of Conservative MPs do, highlighted the product disparity in London and the South East compared to the North. And I pinned him down with a question about this, because I said, look, you talk about the productivity disparity between the South East and the North, but surely, I said, the biggest issue is the transport disparity between the North and the South.
And what did he say in response to that zinger of a question from you?
He said to me, Chris, that's the best question I've ever been asked, and you really should have your own TV show. The point he was making, he didn't try and shy away from the fact that we've got this North-South divide in terms of our transport network. He didn't commit to anything because it's way above his pay grade as well. But the impression I got was that the reason this High Speed 2 announcement came out last week, and the reason the government haven't denied it, is because they're going to say something as regards to the east-west service. The problem they've got is the clock's ticking. We're a year away from an election. Really, I mean, they are, in all essence, a zombie government.
Yeah, so you also had Warrington South Tory MP Andy Carter on your panel, surrounded by all these Tories. You would have been in your element, wouldn't you? So what did he have to say about it?
Well, Andy Carter's quite an interesting character, actually. I quite like Andy
Another
Carter.
Tory that you quite like.
Yeah.
Call me surprised.
I don't like every Tory MP. I just felt he stands by what he believes in. He was speaking about the same. He said, look, when he goes on the doorstep and he's interviewing people.
Phone's going. I think it's Jake Berry with your instructions.
No, Jake Berry isn't one of my favourite Tory MPs.
Go on, carry on. I'm interrupting.
No, but Andy Carter said that when he's on the doorstep interviewing people, he said nobody talks to him about High Speed 2. Nobody talks to him about going down to London on a train 20 minutes less than it currently takes. What they do talk about is the connectivity across the north, getting from Manchester to Leeds, getting from Liverpool to Newcastle. Those sort of journeys take ridiculous amounts of time, and from a business point of view, they're just not happening. We had an audience of about 200 people at this event, and it was at Cineworld. And I asked the audience, I said, right, hands up. I said, hands up who wants High Speed 2 with a connection between Manchester and Birmingham. And there was probably 3 or 4 hands, not many, maybe 10 at most. I said, who wants east-west services? And probably half the room, 3/4 of the room, they put their hands up. And Andy Carter said, that's what I'm hearing on the doorstep. What I would say, this has become a conversation between an either and an or. This isn't High Speed 2 with improved connectivity in the north and an east-west high-speed connection. It's become, okay, which one can you choose? At the moment, and this guy put his hand up. I said, any questions from the audience? He said, look, you're talking about High Speed 2, you're talking about east-west. It would just be nice to get a train that turns up on time.
Yeah.
And then, talking about a Labour politician, Charlotte Nichols said, you know, in London, when you're at the underground and it flashes up, he said, the next train will take 6 minutes. People complain about it. The next underground to Acton is going to take 6 minutes. Oh, 6 minutes, what am I going to do? He said, you know, in the northwest, you would die for that.
Yeah, we don't have a high-frequency service, except the closest thing, I guess, is the Merseyside Underground in Liverpool city centre out to the Burbs, and the Manchester Metrolink.
What do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think it's over. I think HS2, I think they're trying to bury it, or at least it's another poison pill being left by the Tories for Starmer's incoming government. And I noticed over the weekend, again, Labour politicians weren't falling for the trap that's being set for them. Will you commit to HS2 when the Tories are saying potentially that it's not fundable, or they're trying to cut costs on it because the nation can't afford it? Either way, we've been consistently lied to over railway big infrastructure announcements. The Crossrail in Manchester is what's needed. Actually, the surface level bottleneck between the Ordsall Cord just by as you come into Manchester from the west side and Piccadilly Station at the south east side, that is hugely congested. Piccadilly Station's platforms 13 and 14. Now they're high frequency services because they're trains that come in from everywhere and go out to everywhere. And that's what makes journey time so much more difficult.
Final one for me. We've not mentioned him for a while. Middlesbrough MP Simon 7 Weeks Clark, who was briefly the Levelling Up Minister in Liz Truss's government, says that we should 100% scrap Phase 2. No great surprise there. But compare that with the views of former Siemens boss Jürgen Meyer, somebody that we've both interviewed. He said if it's true that the government are going to cancel the Birmingham to Manchester link, the government is, quote, just about to cancel levelling up. Now, Michael, you want to talk about Baroness Charlotte Owen of Alderley Edge, who was appointed to the House of Lords by Boris Johnson at the age of 29, seemingly having done very little to justify that. Fill your boots.
Yeah, so I find the whole sociological drama of Alderley Edge fascinating, as you probably know. It's where I set my comic thriller, my novel, 40 by 40, about a Cheshire bad boy businessman called Roger Cashmore. It was full of absurd characters, many of them based on real people, by the way. But even my lurid imagination couldn't have come up with a character like Baroness Charlotte Owen. She was awarded a peerage by Boris Johnson. Now, looking at Boris Johnson's dishonours list, as it became known, people were horrified by what some people who were being given honours had actually done when they were in government. The thing about Charlotte Owen was she'd been an intern for George Osborne, supposedly. She'd worked in Boris Johnson's team, but nobody could have any recollection whatsoever about anything that she actually did. And it was an absolutely brilliant Tortoise Media podcast about her, and there is just so little known that it's absolutely fascinating. What was your observations on it?
I listened to the same Tortoise Media podcast as well, and I thought it was excellent. But it was basically we haven't found anything that she's done before, after, or during. I don't think she's made any speeches.
Nope.
I mean, even when she was sworn in, it looked contrived.
She didn't seem to have any interest in politics prior to actually going to work for Boris Johnson. And it turned out that the whole did she work for George Osborne turned out, well, George Osborne didn't have interns in his office. She might have handed out a few leaflets in Wilmslow or Alderley Edge for the Tories.
I think she described herself as an intern, but I think she was like doing work experience for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's just, she just had this period of about 18 months when she, had the ear of Boris Johnson. I do need to mention one thing, actually, before I give you a response. But I remember your book, 40 by 40, and I checked last night, actually. It is still available on Amazon for the ridiculously cheap price of £3.43.
That's the grey market for you.
It has a review rating of 4.4 out of 5, which is only marginally less than Northern Spin. Am I right in thinking...
Do you know why I haven't got a higher rating?
Why?
By the way? Yeah, because one person gave it 2 stars. One person, which has dragged it down. That person has only ever reviewed 2 books, right?
Yeah.
Mine that got a negative review, and another book which he gave 5 stars to. And in my review, he says, my book wasn't as good as the other book. I rather suspect it was the author, Matthew Corrigan.
Well, Mr. Corrigan, if you want to come on and deny that to him, I think there might be the bones of another book there. Now, there's this theory about Boris Johnson that he came up with his resignation dishonours list, and he put like 100 names in originally, including his dad Stanley, which got knocked out, and thankfully Nadine Dorries got bumped off the list as well. And he shoved Charlotte Owen in, really, as a bit of a poke in the eye to the establishment.
Yeah.
And every time somebody looks at Charlotte Owen and gets riled, he has a wry smile to himself. Now, you'd think to yourself, that's ridiculous, but then you think, well, we're talking about Boris Johnson and he'll do anything. I don't want to demonise Charlotte Owen, I don't, but she did virtually nothing to become a lifelong peer. And look at all the people who've made remarkable contributions and would actually add something to the House of Lords. But just remember this, right? Every time she sits in the House of Lords, because they're not paid, she gets an allowance, £332 a day. She's in this post for the rest of her life. So you work it out how much money she could take off us, the taxpayer, over the course of her lifetime, and for what? For making Boris Johnson a cup of tea. It's an absolute disgrace.
Yeah. The whole thing is nobody really knows what she did. I think maybe making a cup of tea might be a bit demeaning, but we'll see.
Something else you've got on your high horse about this week. Matthew Brown, the leader of Preston Council, been getting your dander up.
Well, only a little bit. So Preston is going to be hosting the This is the North convention by the People's Powerhouse, which we did a live event at last year. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Available for other live events, by the way, kids. Anyway, Matthew Brown, who shares his name with the brewery in Lancashire, described Preston as the alternative city. So it gave me the opportunity to have one of my regular rants about the Preston economic model. Have you ever heard of the Preston economic model?
Not the term, the Preston economic model.
Okay, so they talk about it like it's socialism in action, but in reality, it's a bit of local procurement and the championing of social enterprises. I wrote a paper on it, and it attempts to pick apart the wider claims, giving due credit instead to Preston being the birthplace of a different centre-left economics in Lancashire County Council in the 1980s, which set up a venture capital arm. Do you remember Lancashire Enterprises and Enterprise PLC? And
probably before my time.
No. Well, anyway, yes.
Okay.
But you were probably at school in Kent when they were doing all that, weren't you? But you live up in that part of the world. Do you think that when you go into Preston, it is the alternative city, the beacon of kind of community socialism?
I've probably got a slightly different view. I do agree with some of what you said. I think the fact that this is the North Convention is coming to Preston is a positive. It's a bit like
for the record, I don't dispute that. It's great that it's been in Sunderland, Bradford, Doncaster, and Manchester, and it's great that it's going to Preston.
It's a bit like when England, take their football on the road away from Wembley. For a long time, everybody would say this: Preston's been in the doldrums. Some people refer to it as Depreston, and sometimes you drive in there on a Saturday morning and it looks depressing. There's two ways of looking at Preston. So for years, the roadworks going into Preston have been horrendous, and I mean horrendous, like an hour to get out of Preston or to get into it.
Why do you take the train then?
Well, because the trains are unreliable and have been for a long time. It's mainly when I'm picking or dropping off my daughter. So that's the reason why I'm driving in there. But you could argue that the roadworks hint at ambition because they're trying to improve, ultimately, the way in and the way out of Preston. They've got a 2-year improvement scheme on Preston's Friargate North and Ringway. So that's due to finish anytime soon. But that's 2 years of misery. A lot of shopkeepers and businesses in the area say it's decimated their trade, but hopefully better times around the corner. There is a project called Animate, it's a £45 million project, which will include a Hollywood Bowl, cinema and restaurants. Will improve the centre, and it's worth making a point as well, Preston North End are top of the championship. So there is a bit of a feel-good factor in Preston.
Oh, I wish you hadn't reminded me of that. I can't do with North End. I really can't. I had a hard high-vis tour, which is a new feature I've done on the business desk. You like that, the hard high-vis tour?
It's not easy to say, though, is it?
Pardon?
It's not easy to say.
No, but it's basically someone showing you around a regeneration or redevelopment project. And I did in Preston. Do you know why it's called Animate, by the way? Why they've chosen that name?
No, I don't know.
No, it's because of a link. Nick Park, the founder of Aardman Animations and Wallace and Gromit. It's kind of a tribute to him. And there's some really nice street furniture, street art and statues with Wallace and Gromit on. And Michael Conlon, who is the founder of Conlon, the chairman of Conlon Construction, which was his father's business. he took me around the Harris Gallery, which is going to be pretty spectacular, actually, when it's done up. So big props to Preston. So there are some good things happening. Little known facts as well. Keith Ingham, the architect of Preston Bus Station. What do you think of that, by the Preston Bus Station?
Well, I mean, that was the suicide capital of whatever, wasn't it? There was
60s brutalism.
Yeah, it's horrendous.
Well, Keith Ingham, the architect, was the stepdad of one of my mates when I was growing up in Lancaster, Russ Coleman, and Keith got me reading Private Eye and listening to Radio 4.
It's like a trip down memory lane for you, this, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Anyway, before we go to the break, you want to talk about why you think we're now on an election footing.
Yeah, what we try and do with Northern Spin is we try and focus on the North, and I think sometimes we're probably both guilty of it. We focus too much on national politics and can't provide any insight. But I think it's worth...
Look what we've just done on Preston.
Absolutely. But look at if you look at what's happening in the last week, I've complained for a long time that, and we've spoken about the Ming-Var strategy. Labour are so concerned about not, taking their eye off the ball and dropping a Horlicks, that they don't say anything. They're just waiting for the Conservatives to lose the election, which they're doing a very good job of doing. I think Keir Starmer's finally recognised the fact that he's got to actually, stand up and start talking about stuff and putting some meat on the bone. So last week he headed to Europol and he put forward his solution to the small boats crisis, which prompted criticism from unions, charities, Tory MPs and the Daily Mail. And I don't think he's worried about any of that, actually. I think what he's trying to appear is a bit of a grown-up... he's talking about grown-up politics. He wants to be seen as a government in waiting. I think you've also got... this week, we're recording this on Monday, he's due to go to Paris, see Emmanuel Macron. I think he's just been over to Canada as well. So I think you're going to see more and more of this. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak, described as an action man by Starmer at PMQs last week, was at a hospital in Devon where he admitted the government might not hit its waiting list targets, pointing the blame firmly, I think, at the strikes as well. I just get the impression that Starmer's being a bit bolder, a bit more ambitious, and he's willing to say things now because he recognises that he's probably been a bit timid. What do you think?
I think he's due to meet Macron in Paris this week as he tries to appear, as you say, more statesmanlike. Last week he met Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, at what the Daily Express hilariously called the International Wokery Convention in Montreal. Where was my invite? I just want to share an observation by Andrew Marr in the New Statesman about Keir Starmer, which I thought was quite incisive. He said, it was a long profile, and this was kind of wrapping things up at the end, and he'd clearly spoken to loads of people who'd known him, worked with him in his inner circle, and he said, I think he would make a far better Prime Minister than a party leader. People who know him well say his best quality is his temperament. He doesn't agonise over personal slights or hostile newspaper headlines. Good. Compared to other political leaders, he has very little ego. He gives others credit and is calm. I mean, you kind of want that in a leader, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where I like where he's coming from is he's willing to tackle the issue a bit more about Brexit now and accept that we have got to work closer with our European counterparts.
Yeah, and you need to be a statesman in order to do that.
Yeah.
That's good. So let's go to the break and hear a little word about our new sponsor, Assets Capital. Assets Capital is a leading Manchester-based independent specialist lender who, for the last 10 years, have supported UK SME, house builders, property investors and business owners to achieve their ambitions. Having lent over 1.7 billion to date and with ambitious growth plans, Assets are well on their way to breaking through the 2 billion of lending as they embark on the next phase of their journey. They have a dedicated team of property professionals and lending specialists who pride themselves on getting to know their customers and being with them on every step of the journey. If you need a straightforward, no-nonsense lending partner with a proven track record, contact Andrew Charnley and the team at Assets Capital. Big enough to matter, small enough to care. Welcome back to part 2 of Northern Spin, and this is the bit we call Anything to See Here. Where are we starting, Chris?
Well, we're going to talk about polls and the validity of election polls. So you shared a map on our WhatsApp group from an organisation called Nowcast showing Labour at the next general election with 409 seats. That's a gain of more than 200. The Tories was just 168. The Lib Dems at 26, and the SNP as well are going to take a bit of a hiding. Anything to see here, or just a load of old bump?
No, I don't think it's a load of old bump. I think it's highly geared electoral mathematics. There's only one Tory seat in the Northwest going to survive on those numbers. Even Tatton, George Osborne's old constituency, turns red. And Macclesfield, Pendle and Clitheroe in the Ribble Valley, a new constituency. Altrincham and Sale West, Sir Graham Brady's seat, which obviously he's retiring from. Proper Tory areas turning to Labour. That also means a crumbling of the red wall, like aerated concrete in a school. Burnley, Hayward and Middleton, all the Boltons, Bury North. Goodbye Jake Berry and Rossendale Chris. You'd be gutted about that one. So yeah, I think a combination of boundary changes. So do you know which is the only Tory constituency that's in the Northwest that's going to survive?
Well, yeah, I would have said Tatton, and I think Tatton will stay Conservative. Which one would it be?
It's filed apparently. See, I think it's overblown. I think they've adopted a uniform swing. Both Hazelgrove and Cheadle will go Lib Dem on those numbers, which I don't doubt, particularly as one of the MPs is standing down. I think they've got Tim Farron as well to lose his constituency in the Lake District. Again, I find that unlikely because I don't think what they've done correctly is priced in certain local contests and contexts.
I think what the impression I'm getting is for Labour to get a majority at the next election, they would need to have a swing similar to what Tony Blair got in 1997. It's huge. So actually becoming the biggest party probably is a given. Becoming the majority party is likely.
This is what the point is, this is what a big swing translates to. And that's what makes you think, wow, yeah, it's eminently doable. It's going to ultimately come down to money. Tory donors aren't going to throw loads of money at saving the Tory party if they don't think they're actually going to survive and get into government and they're going to get any favours for it. And Tory activists aren't going to put their time and efforts on the line if they think actually they're doomed.
Got a bit of a confession to make.
I was looking around in our constituency and, it's about 4 Tories.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a confession to make. I think sometimes we can be too close to it and we can be in our own little bubble. I remember when the Brexit vote came about and I was hosting event after event after event. I was speaking to business people and I said to them, right, hands up if you're going to vote for Brexit. And no hands went up. The odd one went up in a room of 100 people. And people asked me, do you think we'll vote for Brexit? I said, no, definitely not. I said, because people realised the impact it would have on trade. But what you didn't factor in, or what I didn't factor in, is what real people, who didn't have any skin in the game and would just believe the lies that they were peddled by Boris Johnson et al. I hosted a round table, because I mentioned I hosted a lot of events last week, and I did the one with a lot of business leaders, about a dozen people in the room, and I said to him, look, you'll be interested, I must have plugged the Northern Spin podcast 5,000 times last week. And I said to him, if there was an election tomorrow, who would you vote for? So of these super intelligent... You know,
it's really rude to ask people who they vote for. It's
no.
a private thing at the ballot box. A lot of people are what they call shy Tories or shy socialists. They actually don't want to admit it in polite company.
It was
particularly as your large personality will dominate the conversation and people might be intimidated into admitting what their true feelings are one way or the other. I think you've got to be slightly careful about that as a scientific polling.
No, I'm not suggesting a scientific poll. I don't think you can have a scientific poll from a straw poll of 12 people. I think what I was trying to get from them was a bit of a gauge in terms of what their political thinking was. What I found interesting is 3 of them said that they just won't vote at all because they just don't feel connected at all to politics. I think one of them, is a member of the Tory party. But the other array were, some people would describe them as floating voters, other people would describe them as disinterested, ambivalent, keeping their cards to their chest. The interesting thing was, none of them said anything positive about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, and, to be fair, none of them said anything positive about Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party as well. There was just a feeling that, it's going to be bad, and we can't wait for politics and politicians to make our life any better. We've got to do it ourselves as entrepreneurs. That's what I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it is. That is very interesting. I think Labour are in that position where there is an anti-politics feeling around. They don't want to reduce what they're planning for the country to a soundbite for, hope or, we've talked about this before, the Barack Obama hope agenda, reducing everything to a cheap slogan, be that, make Britain great again or build back better or get Brexit done. I think we're past all that kind of hucksterish gimmickry that Johnson, Trump, and the like have demeaned politics. So I think they're dealing with reality and being really straight with the British people. I hope so anyway.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're going to disappoint a lot of people because there ain't any money about.
No, absolutely. I need to ask you another one. Rishi Sunak blasted flip-flopping Keir Starmer after Labour vowed to block his plans to scrap EU-era environmental rules to boost house building. So he's been perceived and painted out as to be the person who's saying no to more house building. Anything to see here?
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged political bear trap, if I may be so bold. I don't know if that's a technical political term. It's not about being against house building. It's about not trusting the water companies to have the infrastructure to not pump sewage into rivers and into the and to actually create proper infrastructure. Could you imagine the furore if Labour had gone the other way on that debate?
No, this is why I mentioned I think we're very much on an election footing, because you're going to see more and more of these bear traps, hoping to catch Keir Starmer out and his shadow cabinet. There's another one I want to ask you about, which is a bit closer to home. The Labour Party suspended its leadership team in Bolton North East after a row over who should represent the party at the next general election. We've spoken about this a lot, haven't we? Anything to see here?
Yeah, apparently it seemed quite heavy-handed, and the local management team of the Bolton North East constituency Labour Party have said, hold on a minute, they're getting rid of the wrong people here. We've sorted out our local difficulties. It does seem quite heavy-handed. The regional party have also taken control of the selection process in Stockport, taking over from a far-left dominated selections and deselections by the local government campaign group there, which cost Labour the council, frankly, as a result of their pointless harassment of good councillors in order to get a left-wing cuckoo in every nest, as they describe their strategy. So yeah, who have we got on manoeuvres, Chris?
Well, it's funny because I always speak to people and I always say, what part of Northern Spin do you like the most? And most people say they like my jokes. But beyond that, they say they like on manoeuvres, where we identify people who we think are, positioning themselves in a favourable position.
You know what? I read the Times this morning and they actually used the phrase, "This is the Labour Party on manoeuvres," in relation to them wooing lots of people in the city.
And they've clearly taken that straight off the Northern Spin podcast. So I'm going to give you a name first of all, Gary Neville. Definitely becoming more. He's becoming more outspoken on politics. He did a really interesting thing, actually. You know, I'm a big fan of women's football, but he swapped his mobile phone with Jill Scott, the Lioness, and she tweeted as him and he tweeted as her during a couple of games, and they highlighted some of the abuse that she got and that he got, you know, when they were posing, and it's just misogynistic, sexist bile, and I think that's where Gary Neville does really well.
So tell me about his row with Jake Berry, because that passed me by. I don't really spend much time on X.
No, I don't spend much time on X, but
go on.
Basically, the former Tory chairman tweeted, "The next time you can't see a doctor, your kids can't go to a school, and your train doesn't turn up, remember Labour's plan is to give even more power to those who are trying to hold Britain to ransom." Now, that argument might work if you could actually currently see a doctor, your kids could go to a school without it falling down, and your train did turn up on time, none of which are currently happening. And that prompted a withering put down by Gary Neville, who accused the Tories of undermining every single public service. He also shared a stage, I think, last week with Alistair Campbell. I think you're going to see more and more interventions from people like Gary Neville, definitely on manoeuvres, but probably because, well, he's a member of the Labour Party.
Well, good. So I read Gary Neville's book over the summer about the football business, which I was exhausted by in the end, I have to say.
What was his...
He's absolutely relentless on everything, isn't he? It's just like, in the end, you just give up.
His business is called Relentless.
I know.
But a lot of people would point towards the money he spent at Salford City and say, actually, he's paying people a lot of money to play for Salford City who are playing in, I think, was it Tier 1?
Yeah.
The second name this week is somebody who we're huge fans of, both of us, because we launched the Northern Spin podcast during her tenure as PM, and that's Liz Truss. Now, we're recording this on Monday. She's giving a speech today. No long words, probably. She's trying to rewrite the history books. I mean, if you want a reminder of what Liz Truss is all about, have a look at your mortgage statement and just have a look at how much it went up by because of her Trussonomics and her disastrous, you know, mini budget. She's going to claim this week that that her economic plan would have saved the government $35 billion. It's absolutely embarrassing, as is the fact that she's got a new book called 10 Years to Save the World. She couldn't last 50 days as the Prime Minister. It's an absolute disgrace. She's on manoeuvres.
Yeah, agree with that. She definitely thinks her ideas were stymied by a left-wing establishment of bond traders in the city, the Bank of England, and the House of Lords. Unbelievable. Yep, she's got a book out, and her ill-thought-through small state tax-cutting nonsense is the hope of all the nutters in the Tory party that they're clinging to. It's amazing. This is all about the battle for the soul of the Tory party when they lose the election. They're not going to move to the centre. They're going to move even further to the right. It's just which right is it? Is it the free market, small state right, or is it going to be the swashbuckling thick right of Lee Anderson who just want to build stuff? And yeah.
You're right. She's trying
That's
to
what it's
plant.
about.
She's trying to plant a seed now in terms of what direction the Conservative Party goes after the next general election, and she wants to be involved in that. I mean, she's not doing any. I haven't heard any interviews yet, so she's just trying to create this rhetoric. And when she's trying to rewrite the history books, I don't like it, and I don't like her. Somebody I do quite like, actually, though, is a leader of the Commons, Penny Mordaunt. She's the third
you've
name.
got such a soft spot for a posh Tory, haven't you?
No, I haven't. I just think she's a character.
Penny, the twinkle in your eye when you talk about Penny Mordaunt.
No, there is no twinkle in my eye at all. It's just my eye. She loves a soundbite, though, because I think she's a bit mischievous. She's got a load of cats as well, actually, and I've got a lot of cats as well. So maybe that's why I've got a certain soft spot for her. But I listen to newscast on BBC Radio 5 Live, and they do the credits at the beginning and the intro, and they use a quote that she famously gave when Liz Truss was briefly Prime Minister and AWOL, and she said, "The Prime Minister is not under a desk," knowing how that would play out. So this week, Keir Starmer, called Rishi Sunak Inaction Man, and she responded by describing him as Keir Starmer as Beach Ken, and said he had zero balls. Now, she knows what she's doing, doesn't she?
Now I've seen the film Barbie. You're going to see it this week with your family, aren't you?
No, it's just me, actually.
Oh, you're going on your own?
Well, yeah, I'll be there at the back with a popcorn. Yeah, for the purpose of research, Michael.
Yeah, she does know what she's doing. My hunch, though, is that I don't think the wider public like all this name calling, the nicknames and the banter. And I know we're as responsible for it with Simon 7 Weeks Clark and Ben Blocker Houch and all the other cast of characters. But I must admit, I winced when I heard Keir Starmer taunt Sunak as Inaction Man. It is stooping to the level of Boris Johnson and his Captain Hindsight and flip-flopping and Ken and all of that sort of stuff. I don't like it. I don't think the public like it. And I think it's dragging politics ever more into the gutter. And on that note, we'll go on.
I was just going to say, do you not think, though, that this, taunts like Inaction Man and everything else, they're only playing to their own MPs. They're not playing to the public at large.
Of course they're playing to the public at large. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I quite like the Inaction Man.
I know you do.
Line, and I just got a feeling that's going to stick.
But this is like you having banter with a wicket-keeper at your cricket match, isn't it? You love all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that was X-rated, but anyway.
Anyway, on that note, we're going to go to a quick break. I've always believed that a vibrant media sits at the heart of any community, and the business community is no different. So if you're in business, then thebusinessdesk.com is for you. We're up with the lark every morning to bring you the day's business news. We have regular events, credible news, and lots and lots of other events to bring people in the business community together. So log on now, thebusinessdesk.com, for all your regional news.
Welcome back to part 3 of the Northern Spin podcast. Now, Michael, we've both been busy. What do you want to talk about this week?
I wanted to talk about my T-shirt, actually. It says New Berlin. Do you know what it's a reference to?
Something to do with Stockport, isn't it?
It is. So, yeah, Luke Unabomber, once who's a DJ, lives in Stockport, described my hometown as the New Berlin, and people have adopted it. So
do you ever wear a tie?
In massive breach of copyright of New Balance, but I like it. It's a nice T-shirt.
Would you ever wear a tie again?
No.
Never. So we can.
Well, I did when I worked at Blackburn Rovers, and now I don't. I probably won't again, unless I was, a dignitary coming in, or I was dressing up for a special occasion. But for work, I never do.
Okay.
No. Anyway, I'm going to start by asking you about that lump underneath your right eye. Did somebody finally have enough of your ridiculous dad jokes and smack you in the face?
No, I would like to. I'd like to say that was the case, but no, sadly it wasn't. No, I played cricket the weekend, last game of the season it's funny. There's a lot of club cricketers listen to us actually, and the season, there's no hiding place over the course of a season. But for the first time in my life, at the age of 51, I actually got hit by a cricket ball in the face. I just got an inside edge onto my pad, and it reared up and it hit me on the cheekbone. I've got absolutely no sympathy off anybody. I've got scratches down my leg as well because I took a catch and the studs from my shoes, gouged out my leg. So one thing I do want to mention, actually, much more upbeat than that, is I went to a comedy night.
Oh.
Yeah. My brother came up and his girlfriend, and I took my kids along as well and my wife. And I said, I'm going to promise you a comedy night you won't forget. And I took him to Standish Social Club, which was very, very interesting. You don't get more northern than that, Michael, let's be honest.
Was it like the Phoenix?
It was interesting. The thing with, if you like comedy, and I do, it was a social club, so it didn't necessarily lend itself to comedy. It wasn't that intimate sort of section. I think what it does do is it sort of really showcases really good comedians. There was a guy called Lopez, a Spanish comedian. He was the first up. He was absolutely brilliant. Two other comedians, but they weren't as good as the first guy. But it was good fun. I enjoyed it. 100 people in the room. A few jokes that I could share.
Good. You going to share any of them with us? Can you remember what they were?
Yeah, there was one guy who said that he was a second comedian on, and he said, you know what, he's very posh. He said, I went to public school, only got 3 GCSEs. What I want to talk about is that I was a boarder. Thing is, I couldn't understand why I was a boarder for. My parents only lived 20 minutes away, but I still got to see my parents when they picked up my brother. So that's the reason I'm not a comedian for, but that made me laugh.
Timing, eh?
What about you? Any podcast recommendations? Any things you want to talk about?
Yeah, I do. So I went to the cinema last night, Sunday night, to indulge the guiltiest of my guilty pleasures, violent British gangster films. In this case, Rise of the Foot Soldier, Vengeance, which is the 6th film in that franchise. It is absurd, violent, and unknowingly funny. And it does feature Craig Fairbrass, who I think is a massively underrated actor.
Go do your Craig Fairbrass accent, because, listeners of the podcast do like your accents.
You know good slag.
What, is that directed at me or anybody else?
Yeah, it's very much aimed at you. Anyway, any podcasts?
Yeah, I listened to a few this week. We were talking on WhatsApp about the new Ed Balls and George Osborne podcast, Political Currency. See, I think the genre's sort of been set by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, two opposing politicians from different parties who've got slightly different views, but they are really warm. And then Ed Balls and George Osborne have come together. George Osborne isn't funny. I think Ed Balls is probably a slightly warmer character as well. And I listened to the trailer, which I didn't like because it was too matey. It was too, hey, look at us, boys. We were two enemies over the dispatch box. Now we've got a podcast. Isn't this great? I listened to the first show, and I want to give it a fair crack. And there was definitely more insight there than there was over the first one. But there wasn't the warmth that you had with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. The Sunday Times described it as Political Currency Podcast Review. Balls and Osborne are a shadow of former selves. Is there a worry that you're creating this formulaic podcast as two middle-aged white guys doing a podcast? Maybe we aren't the best people to comment, but what's your take on it?
I think it's a very crowded market. You've got to have your own distinctive something to say. I think we have with our Northern angle, which is a bit niche, but I think we make it work. I only really care about what we can do rather than comment on anybody else's. I haven't got time to listen to absolutely every podcast out there. It is important that we keep abreast of the developments in that world, though. And I was a bit surprised that they came out with it, to be honest with you.
I think the problem with that one is it's two politicians.
Yeah.
That I think that's why the other one works for. Quick book reference as well. This will come as no surprise, but Richard Osman, who's really reinvented himself as an author. He came up with this idea called the Thursday Murder Club. I think he's on his 4th book now. It's just come out last week, called The Last Devil to Die, and it's just if you've never read it, you're in for a treat. But it's basically people in a retirement home who decide to set up a Thursday Murder Club, and all the enjoyment is in the detail. I can recommend that one.
Do you think murdering people's fun, do you?
Well, the thing is, I like true crime, and I've got so many podcasts which I've referenced on this podcast before, but this is if you can make murder fun, this is fun, but you won't know what I mean unless you've read the book. So, The Last Devil to Die.
So, if you like true crime, are you aware of the kind of the origin story of the Rise of the Foot Soldier series, that it's based on the murder of 2 or 3 guys in a Range Rover in a lay-by in Essex?
Yeah.
The Rettendon Range Rover murders of Pat Tate and Tony Tucker.
Yeah, no, I remember that. That murder. It was up like a dirt track, wasn't it?
In a woods in Essex.
Yeah, and they've been in there for hours on end. Did they ever catch the culprits?
Apparently so, yeah. But
Okay.
the speculation, they got the wrong geezer.
You've had some feedback from one of our regular listeners, Ian
we
from
have.
Mellor.
Yeah, we've had we had
I
a
might know
message.
him.
Yeah, we had a message from Ian from Mellor, one of our listeners who lives in my local area. He was very cross that I am too soft on William Ragg, our Conservative MP in the Hazel Grove constituency. He's the invisible man, says Ian. He's never around. He never responds. He's a waste of space. And I have to say, actually, that is not a unique view of our MP in the constituency. To be fair to him, he has announced he's leaving Parliament, so he's looking obviously for something new to do. He's had his own mental health challenges. He's had time off work. But I think the point that Ian is making is he's not visible. So it was the annual Food and Drink Festival in Marple on Saturday. Street stalls all the way up Market Street, which is great. And there was no sign of William Ragg anywhere. No sign of any of the 4 local Tories who you sometimes see on Twitter with their new candidate, Paul Athens. Yet the Lib Dem candidate, who I hold no particular torch for, was very visible, very involved, walking around, talking to people. So, yeah, I think that's quite telling, really.
You've always been, full disclosure, you've always been very generous about William Ragg, because obviously you stood for Parliament in 2015 against William Ragg, and he beat you. But you've spoken about the fact you've had some good conversations, and you have mentioned his mental health, and you've wished him all the best. I think it's interesting because so many Conservative MPs have announced they're not standing at the next general election, and there's going to be a real question mark as to whether or not they literally are demob and you just don't see them. But I think it's really important for us as a podcast that we put both sides of the story. You know?
Yeah, do you know 2 of our listeners also live in a flat above his office? I was trying to encourage them to take up Irish dancing on Fridays when he was up in the constituency, but he's not been seen, so there's no point. Anyway, we had a lively debate on the business desk last week and on my LinkedIn feed about high streets, following a story I did about the aftermath of Wilko collapsing, Vaughan Allen of Cityco, who I've done a podcast with in the past, and Matt Baker of the Institute for Place Management at Manchester Met University had a very polite exchange of views about crime, retail and high streets in the comments section. I think some high streets are dying, genuinely. Hyde, for one, which is quite near where I live, and they need a real recalibration of purpose. I don't know. What do you think about where places around your locality? Retail is definitely changing. Shoplifting seems to have been decriminalised by the police, who simply won't call out and come and visit a scene of a crime if it's for a value of less than 200 quid.
I am not a shopper. I'm not.
I thought you were going to say you're not a shoplifter.
No, I'm not a shoplifter or a shopper. But I'm not a shopper. But I went to Ormskirk recently. I'm quite a functional shopper. I'm in and out like the SAS, you know, and I don't mess about. But if you go, I mean, we've mentioned it before, Altrincham is great.
Well, Altrincham is the good example of somewhere that's reinvented itself.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, we mentioned Preston on the podcast earlier. Where would you go to actually relax, have a good time? Where are the coffee bars? Where's the independence? Chorley's works hard, but if you speak to Chorley or people in Chorley, they'll say it's full of charity shops. Yeah. I hate the rise of vape shops as well, with their crude messaging to try and target kids as well. So you're absolutely right. I think retail centres have got to have a purpose, and if they've not got a purpose, then they're doing something wrong. I like local authorities that offer free parking for a period of time as well, because you've got to offer something to try to bring people in. That
is one of the examples that's been used.
Have you been to Blackburn recently?
No, I just go in and out to the footy, I have to say.
Yeah.
Why? What do you think?
Well, I went recently. What I find interesting is city centres where there are very few places to park, or it's easy to park. I find that just scares off motorists, and you get stuck in a one-way system. And like, I found Blackburn not the easiest place to navigate myself around, and I worry about driving down bus lanes and getting hit with fines. That's what scares me.
Do you know what? There are the 3 worst words in politics when politicians talk about groups of people that I dislike more than anything else, in reverse order of how much I dislike them. Taxpayers, right? That's appealing to people's base instincts. The second is motorists, particularly when you hear Tories talking about the motorist, Labour's war on the motorist. And the one I hate more than any other is expat.
Expat.
Yeah. You don't talk about expat Afghanis and Iraqis living in this country, do you?
No.
But it's always expat in Spain or Cyprus or wherever. Anyway, we'll talk about that on a future episode.
Yep.
Anyway, culture-wise, my lunch of the month so far is the medium falafel wrap that I got from Go Falafel, which I thought was great. All preparation for my holiday in Israel. And that's all for episode 3 of season 5 of Northern Spin.
Don't you think it's great, though, that we have these podcasts and people are talking about all sorts of highbrow things, but we go to this area of subject, Go Falafel.
Go Falafel.
That should be, maybe we can get them to sponsor
We
Northern
should
Spin.
do.
With
Yeah,
Go
we
Falafel.
absolutely should. If you do want to sponsor the Northern Spin podcast, Go Falafel, you know where to get in touch. We're on Apple Podcasts. Please review us. Don't forget to press the subscribe button. Follow us on Twitter at Northern_Spin1 or watch us on YouTube. Thank you to What Media for recording this podcast. Thank you to our sponsors, FI Real Estate Management and Assets Capital. Special mention to Elliot Taylor for providing his musical accompaniment, New Beginnings. My name is Michael Taylor.
And my name, as ever, is Chris Maguire.